All right, I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Hallman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Welcome to the 2019 Shaw-Mannell Research Award reception and lecture. Thank you everybody for coming today. I see this as being perhaps our most important event during the year. This along with our Girls Symposium, which takes place in the spring. So I appreciate you being here to celebrate leisure research. Here we are in the quantum nano computing building, perhaps the jewel of the University of Waterloo in terms of buildings on campus. It's interesting, last week I had the privilege of joining a presidential delegation to China to represent applied health sciences. When I started out the week, I had an opportunity to have breakfast with the Dean of Math, Stephen Watt. And I mentioned that because I was quite amazed when I shook his hand to introduce myself, and he immediately mentioned how impressed he was with our department and its international ranking. I thought that was quite remarkable on a campus that's known for the STEM disciplines, but really ought to also be known for leisure research and the contributions that our department makes to it. So today is, as I mentioned, a very important date in our event calendar. Today we really do celebrate leisure research, and we do so by awarding what I think is a really prestigious award, the Shaw-Mannell Leisure Research Award, which is given to somebody who's made an incredible contribution to leisure research in our field and had an influence on individuals in our department. I'm quite delighted that our recipient this year is Dustin, who is from the University of Utah and will be our 2019 recipient of the award. I'm going to leave it to Dr. Mayer to introduce our speaker in a few minutes, but before I do so, I just want to thank all those people who made this event possible. First of all, Hillary Prouse, who's up at the top. Hillary is our events and social media coordinator. We also want to thank Darcy Prince, who is our undergraduate program assistant. Of course, Sandy Heisey, who of course does a lot of work in our department, and of course had a hand in helping out with this event as well. I'd also like to thank all those graduate students who contributed posters to this event. So after the lecture, we will open it up to questions, and after the question period, we'll invite people upstairs to a reception where they can mingle with each other and ask students questions about our research projects. So thank you to Dr. Ryan Snellgrove for allowing his class to participate in this wonderful event. And thank you to the class for actually contributing to it. I'd also like to thank our Dean, Lily Liu, who supports this event through a contribution from the Hallman Endowment. So I'm going to give her an opportunity to welcome everybody and to say hello, as well as to introduce some information about the Hallman lecture series. So please give a round of applause for her.
Hello everyone, welcome. I have to say that this is a secret. I'm going to begin with a secret. I have a secret little regret, and that is that being the new dean starting in September and 3 of my kids entering post-secondary education, I'm secretly hoping one of them would come to Waterloo. None of them did. My son did apply to Rec and Leisure, but he got a first offer from the art school in Toronto, so he grabbed that in case he couldn't get in. So Troy and I are still working on him, trying to entice him to apply to Waterloo, maybe for a graduate degree. It is a very special department in my heart. I just love the subjects. I love reading about the work that you're doing. The posters look wonderful. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you today on behalf of the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences. I'd like to especially welcome our Hallman lecturer, Dr. Dustin, who is receiving the 10th Shaw-Mannell Leisure Research Award today. This important award in their names. Well, I should also mention that we are honored to also be in the presence of Roger Mannell, who is from Recaptiulation Leisure Studies Department, whom this award commemorates. Susan Shaw had another commitment, so is unable to be with us, but I'm sure she's thinking of us. So back to this award, it's in their names and recognizes established scholars in the field of leisure studies whose work has had an international impact. So today, Dr. Dustin will share his reflection on how these two individuals influence his career, and I hope I can stay for the entire presentation. I'm really looking forward to this. The Recaptiulation Leisure Studies Department strong global reputation has measured by high scores as on indices such as the academic ranking of world universities, Shanghai subject rankings, and also the Quacquarelli-Simmons ranking. So this adds particular prestige to this award. The commitment and excellence that our Recaptiulation Leisure Studies Department shows is perpetuated through the Hallman Lecture Series. Through these lectures, we demonstrate the faculty's commitment to promoting health and well-being in our community in a very tangible way. This series stems from the legacy of Lyle Hallman, a generous local philanthropist and donor who was very interested in community and health. Not only was he well known in the local community, he was recognized for his work through many awards and distinctions, including an honorary doctorate from the University of Waterloo, as well as the Order of Canada. After he passed away in 2003, the generous donations made by Lyle and his wife, Wendy, allowed our faculty to create endowments to expand and sustain health promotion activities. This funding has had significant impact on our community's health and well-being through research activities, through the spread of knowledge related to health promotion, through events such as today's lecture. So we here at the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences are very pleased to acknowledge and show our gratitude to them for their vision and support. I'd also want to thank the Department of Recaptiulation Studies for organizing this event, particularly to Hilary Krause, to Sandy Heiss, and Darcy Prinz. I invite everyone to enjoy this upcoming lecture, the award ceremony, the reception. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your attendance.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Heather Mayer, and I'm a professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies. And it is my absolute pleasure to stand here today and to present this honor to Dr. Dan Dustin, the 2019 Shaw-Mannell Leisure Research Award. For those who don't know, the Shaw-Mannell Award was created in 2000 and is intended as a celebration of excellence in leisure research. According to the nomination guidelines, nominees must embody one or more of the attributes characteristic of the University of Waterloo. Namely, their research must be innovative, creative, collaborative, courageous, risky, critical, unconventional, and/or connected. Professor Susan Shaw and Roger Mannell, after whom the award was named, were longtime colleagues in the department, and their groundbreaking work will shape our field for generations. The Shaw-Mannell Award honors contemporary scholars who embody both the hallmarks of their scholarly achievements and their efforts to create welcoming paths for future scholars. In his nomination letter for Dan, Professor Mark Hovitz wrote, Dan Dustin is one of the most introspective scholars in the history of leisure studies. In contrast to the norm and among his peers in the field, Dan has made an enormous impact. His fortes include a gift for conceptual thinking, exquisite writing, and deep philosophical musing. Dustin was doing autoethnography before anyone else in the field had discovered the concept. Indeed, his memorized half-hour narrative of a 100-mile run through the Sierra Nevada mountains, delivered while running on a treadmill at the 1988 NRPA Leisure Research Symposium, remains one of the most famous conference presentations in our field's history. This essay has been reprinted since in a broader work titled The Wilderness Within. Mark continues, Dan is a big picture guy. We see evidence of this in his work with Tom Goodale, Making a Difference in the Academic Life, a handbook for park, recreation, and tourism educators and graduate students. His thinking on leisure and spirituality, nature and the human spirit, towards an expanded land management ethic, community, service living, building community through public parks and recreation, and his unconventional approaches to gathering current scholars, such as the National Park Service workshops, the Zion Workshop for Chairs and Deans, and future scholars. Dan is a primary champion and benefactor of the ALS Future Scholars Program. From my perspective, Dan has also had an abiding interest in our department and in Canadian scholars. Early in my career, I received an email from Dan asking me to contribute to a book he was editing with Karen Paisley entitled Speaking Up, Speaking Out, Working for Social and Environmental Justice in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. I don't have that email anymore, but I can paraphrase. And you'll appreciate that these are among the most thrilling sentences a junior scholar, or maybe any scholar, could receive. Dan asked, "What bugs you about our field? When you think about recreation and leisure studies, what sticks in your craw? Write about that. I want you to be part of this conversation." And I wasn't alone. Dan's invitation to me and others who were relatively junior at the time felt like a door had opened. A feeling was that our views were valuable and the community wanted to hear from us. I still cherish that collection. One of the most powerful and among one of my favorite papers that Dan wrote, co-written with Jeff Rose in 2009, is called The Neoliberal Assault on the Public University, The Case for Recreation, Park, and Leisure Research. Dustin and Rose, characteristically, took on the challenges we were facing as a field in the US and here. The commodification of undergraduate experiences, the growing impact of external funding in determining tenure and promotion opportunities, and broad threats to intellectual passion and social service ethics that shape our research and teaching. They also, of course, point to the way of resistance, singling out the powerful, i.e. full professors and administrators, and underscoring their responsibility to guard against these threats. They write, "Finally, it is incumbent on administrators and professors alike to take the traditional purpose of the public, to keep the traditional purpose of the public university alive. A higher education ought not to be primarily about preparing workers for the marketplace. The role of the university ought to be about preparing people for civic engagement in a participatory democracy. The intellectual, spiritual, and emotional aspects of a higher education should not be lost amidst the prevalent culture of neoliberalism. Educating the student body is the heart of the academic enterprise. This education should center on the question of how to live a responsible life." Now that paper was written more than 10 years ago, but the message, as with so much of Dan's work, remains today. Professor Dustin is the former chair of Utah's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, the former Foss Professor and chair of the Department of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation at Florida International University in Miami, professor and chair of the Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism at San Diego State University. He's the past president of the Society of Parks and Recreation Educators and the Academy of Leisure Sciences. He's also the recipient of the National Recreation and Park Association's Literary Award. Indeed, and as Professor Hobbits noted so well, Dan Dustin truly embodies the spirit of the Shaw-Mannell Award. And I'm so thrilled to be able to welcome you here for a new generation of scholars to be taken in and to take up your ideas, and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say today. Thank you.
I'm honored, I'm humbled, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'm honored because I know I'm a student of leisure studies. I know the place of Roger Mantle and Sue Shaw in the advancement of leisure studies. So to even be associated with their names, for me, is incredible. I'm humbled because I'm aware of the list of former recipients and their stature in the field. And I'm grateful that you've made a place for me in that company, because I know I'm cut from a different cloth. You're going to find as I talk that my leanings are more journalistic than they are social science. And so when Troy indicated that I was going to be the recipient, I even wrote back and said, "Are you sure you've got the right Dan Dustin?" And here I am. A few things you should know about me before we begin. When I started out in higher education, I was even more insecure than I am now. I was particularly afraid of public speaking, so the first opportunity I had to participate in a conference in a formal way, I wrote out a script and I memorized everything I was going to say, and I delivered the script and I got really good feedback. And I thought, this is really neat because folks think I'm smarter than I am. Then I was able to publish my talk, and I said, oh, this is the cat's meow, 2 birds with 1 stone. And so I started making a habit out of that. And it was okay for a while. The problem was I created something of a monster because people came to expect that when I talked, they would get a script. And I've had to live with that for 43 years. I'm going to break from that tradition today. I'm actually going to talk to you, I guess, extemporaneously. Is that the word? I've never used it before. That doesn't mean I haven't given any thought to what I'm going to say, but it means I'm going to sort of form the words as I'm talking. So this, for me, is a big risk, and you'll learn more about risk as we go forward. I don't know how many undergraduate students are in the room or graduate students, but what I have to say is directed primarily at you. It's not because I think people longer in the tooth, there's no help for them, but I just think you're at a point in your life when some of the things I talk about might be particularly relevant, and you may not be aware of their relevancy. I was telling Roger earlier today that one of the things I learned about myself that I didn't know was how important the 20s are, when you're in your 20s, are to sort of forging the adult you're going to become. And I only really made that connection in the last probably decade of my life, and you'll see that as we go forward, why that's the case. I love the magic of this. Before I start talking, because at least part of me is a pointy-headed professor, I'm going to give you a couple of ideas that I hope will help you frame what I have to say, interpret what I have to say. The first comes from E.F. Schumacher, a British economist who was most well known for a book he wrote back in the 20th century called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. He wrote a book just before he passed away that is called A Guide for the Perplexed. And this is the book that I would encourage you to take a look at if you've never seen it. I found it in one of those bins at San Diego State where the books weren't selling. So they put a little star on the book, and for $1 you could get it. And my life was falling apart, and the title just jumped out at me. If anybody needs this book, it's me. And it's just chock full of ideas about how to make sense out of the world, about your place in the world. And I'm going to talk about one little idea in that book that's really been useful for me. And it's an idea that he talks about as the 4 fields of knowledge. Okay? And he says the first field of knowledge, when you're doing the talking, as I am now, is my own invisible interior, okay? Which none of you can see. And none of you have direct access to it. I can't see it either, but I have direct access to it. I have access to my feelings, my thoughts, my emotions, so on and so forth. The second field of knowledge is your invisible interiors, which I cannot see. No one else but you has direct access to them. The third field of knowledge is my appearance to you, directly visible to all of you, but I can't see myself from the outside looking in. Well, Dan, go stand in front of a mirror, but I get a reversed image. I'm still not really, The fourth field of knowledge is the larger world. And Schumacher draws 2 conclusions about those 4 fields of knowledge. First, he says the most important fields are the invisible ones. My life experience tells me that's the case. The most important and interesting stuff is what's inside of me that you can't see, and what's inside of you that I can't see. The second thing Schumacher reasons, and this explains a lot of the writing I do, he said if you have any hope of making sense of the second, third, and fourth fields of knowledge, you've got to get to know the first field, your own invisible interior. How can I make much sense of your sort of reaction to me if I have no sense of myself, right? How can I empathize with you if I have no sense of what I'm like, and so on and so forth. So a lot of my writing is anchored in that first field of knowledge. Pointy-headed professors have to have theories. This is the theory that has been the most useful to me in trying to understand anything about life. Are you all familiar with chaos theory? It's this kind of simple idea that a little bitty thing way out here, positive or negative, down the road can result in an incredibly large impact. positive or negative. We know this happens. The maddening thing for scientists is you can't predict if or when it's going to happen. The iconic example is a butterfly flapping its wings in the rainforests of Central America, affecting the weather patterns over Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, right? So as I go forward and I share with you just a bunch of little quick stories, ask yourself, is this an example of chaos theory? All right. Is Corey Johnson in the room? He's not here, is he? Because I wanted to tease him about this. First of all, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, so my home is not that far west from where we are right now. I went to the University of Michigan. I majored in cultural geography because of those two human beings. I was going to tease Corey about the fact that Professor Kish always wore a bow tie, and I saw on your website that Corey has a bow tie on, so I wanted him to know he's keeping good company. Dr. Kish, a lot of you don't know Tom Goodale. He's a friend of mine, but he's about 5'2". Tom would say God built him to be environmentally friendly, right? Anyway. But Dr. Kish specialized in the geography of Europe. And he would go up to the lectern and he would take out a pocket watch and he would put it there, and then he would start just enthralling the students with stories about Europe. We called his classes Dining and Winding Your Way Through Europe. A wonderful man. The man on the right, John Kollars, he specialized in the geography of Africa. What I liked about Kollars was his flamboyance. He would take long wooden devices, maybe we used them to pull maps down, I don't know, but he'd throw them across the room to show us what a Zulu warrior might be doing or something, and he would cut his tie to make a point. He would do all these outrageous things. But the point I want to make is I liked cultural geography, but I majored in it because of these two people. I wanted to be like them, right? And so I got close to graduation. I'm going to be a cultural geographer. I'm going to the University of California, Berkeley, to specialize in Latin American geography. I'm going to study Spanish. I'm going to move to Latin America, and I'm going to live an Indiana Jones kind of life. That was my assumption at that point in time. It also happened that I had the first real girlfriend in my life during my senior year at the University of Michigan. She was a year behind me. She was a German major. She was spending her year abroad in Germany. And so my graduation present to myself was going to be to visit her. At the time, this was during the Vietnam War, at the time, if you were going to leave the country and you didn't have a student deferment, and I wouldn't because I would have graduated, you had to let your draft board know. My draft board responded by drafting me. That was the end of my trip to Europe. That was the end of my girlfriend, right? Who went on, I was telling Roger, to have a wonderful career at the University of Windsor, right in Ontario, right across from Detroit. And I, of course, was in the military in my 20s. This becomes really important. We're going to come back to this. Because of my love for foreign language, well, first of all, I had a conversation with my dad. He was a Navy officer in the Second World War. He said, Dan, if you give them a little more time, they might invest more in you, and you might not be cannon fodder. So I went to a recruiter, and we talked about language opportunities, and there was a 3-year program in military intelligence, and I was all ready to sign on the dotted line when he said the only language we have left is Vietnamese. And I said, well, let me think about it, right? So I started out the door, and he said, but there is a 4-year program in the Army Security Agency, and there might be more options for you, right? So at the time, I've never been good at math. I'm not a quantitative person, but I thought the difference between 3 and 4 was 1. I didn't realize it's 365 days times 24 hours times 60 minutes, you know. And so I signed without any guarantee of what my assignment was going to be. But I ended up going to basic training in a place called Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And at the end of that 8 or 9 week period, 168 of the 170 men there went to Vietnam. 2 of us went to Monterey, California to study Russian. I was a Russian linguist on the East-West German border for 2 years. So the point is, I was incredibly lucky. I was incredibly fortunate. In a sense, I still say this to this day, I think my intellect got me out of combat. But even though I was in Europe, I still became disillusioned with people. I was not a good soldier. I was a citizen soldier who didn't want to be there. I didn't advance. I just had a lot of issues. And I decided when I came home that what I wanted to do was save wilderness. People were letting me down. Wilderness wasn't letting me down. So I thought there's something worth fighting for. So I went back to the University of Michigan. I got a master's degree in the School of Natural Resources, and my primary mentors were a man on the lower left named B.L. Driver, who went on to be a very famous social scientist for the Forest Service, and on the right was a man named Ross Toscher. Driver played to the left side of my brain. He was a behavioral psychologist. Toscher played to the right side of my brain. He was a visionary. I also was a student of Stephen and Rachel Kaplan. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kaplans. They're environmental psychologists at Michigan. They are the mother and father of attention restoration theory. And the third person I just introduced at the top is a man named Roger Ulrich. Do any of you know that name, Roger Ulrich? Okay, he's very famous for a study he published in 1984 in Science called A Room with a View May Influence Recovery from Surgery. But here's what's neat about the story for me. When I was a freshman at Michigan, my first year, I was in a dorm in Adams House in West Quad, and down the hall there was another guy, a rich kid from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, named Roger Ulrich. And he used to wear a sweater, tie it around his neck, and have penny loafers without socks. I mean, he was really rich, and he knew it, and talk about privileged, right? Well, I only know what I'm about to tell you because Roger told me this story 20 years later. When I was a freshman at Michigan, I managed to talk my way into a doctoral seminar taught by one of the country's foremost interpretive educators at the time, a man named Grant Sharp. And apparently, when I would come back from class, I would just rave about how neat all this stuff was. So that was it. I never saw Roger Ulrich again until 20 years later when he told me this story. And he said, well, after Ann Arbor, you went into the Army. I went traveling across Europe. I went to Scandinavia. I met a woman. I fell in love. I was going to start a life, and it's like, what do I want to do next? And he said, I remembered you talking so favorably and fondly about the School of Natural Resources. He went back to Michigan. He became a student of the Kaplans. He ended up doing this very famous study of gallbladder patients recovering from surgery in a Fort Worth hospital, and half the patients looked out onto the human-built environment. The other half looked out onto nature. The patients looking out onto nature were discharged earlier. There's something inherently therapeutic about nature. And that little 2-page article in Science in 1984 spawned an incredible line of research that continues to this day. Before I go forward, I also want to mention something else. This also sort of illustrates something that, I don't know, Troy, if this has ever been done in your department, but I ended up writing in the early 2000s a history of Michigan's program called Tracings from an Intellectual Family Tree, a University of Michigan story, where we followed sort of not only the influence of Driver and Toscher on students, but their predecessors. And the idea was, we know what family trees are like. Can we think about intellectual family trees? So I think if it's never been done here, it'd be a great master's project for a student to write a history of your department like this. And I can send you copies, lots of copies of what that looks like if you're interested, or any of you are interested. All right. I went from Michigan to the University of Minnesota for a PhD. I show you this slide quickly for a number of reasons. My mentor at the time was a man named John Schultz, the upper left-hand fellow. He immediately turned me over to my closest, probably friend in higher education throughout the years, Leo McAvoy, in the lower right-hand corner. But it's the two gentlemen, the lower left and upper right, that I want to mention briefly. The man on the lower left is named Arthur Harkins. He's a futurist. He edited the book there. You can see the kind of guy he must have been. I didn't know there were cultures beyond the earth, and he was writing books about them. And he never made me, I've never had anyone make me feel more uncomfortable about what I think I know. And now, several years later, I realize how important he was to me. And later on, don't let me forget, I want to come back to him for just a second. Larry Merriam in the upper right-hand corner was a forestry professor. He was on my committee. And one of the neatest things that happened during my defense of my dissertation is they got in an argument that lasted 45 minutes. And Harkins said, I was talking about wilderness and saving wilderness. Dan, this is not a big issue. You know, Dan, tell me what the implications are of recombinant DNA research for wilderness. I didn't know what to say. And Schultz up in the upper left sort of interpreted the intent of the question, and when Larry Merriam got it, then he and Harkins argued forever about that. Larry grew up in Yosemite Valley. His father was the superintendent of Yosemite National Park, and his best friend was Ansel Adams. So, okay. My first job offer is San Diego State University, or my first job. I was telling Roger, the day after I accepted the job, I got a call, my parents got a call in Michigan from David Ng at the University of Waterloo wondering, you know, if I were still in the hunt for a job, and I wasn't at the time, but chaos, right? And Roger and I were debating whether that was good for you here or good for me, you know, right. But, okay, I put this slide up because another thing I want you to say, or to think about, for me in life, the joke is always on me. It's always on me, no matter what, it's on me. And this is a great story. It wasn't this woman in particular, but this is the kind of things life does to me. So I was at San Diego State. I was in a class, maybe 50, 60 people in it. Every class period at the end of the hour, this beautiful young woman would stay around to make small talk. And I was flattered, right? And I was in my early mid-30s. I was single. It was like, God, do you think she could actually be interested in me? And sure enough, the last day of the semester, class is over, exams are over, students have left the room, and she comes up to me and she says, you know, Dr. Dustin, you probably noticed that I've been hanging around, engaging in small talk. Anyway, gee, I'm just wondering if you'd be interested in going out with my mother. You know, and again, if I were a balloon, right? All right. I love these stories. The joke's always on me. This young man was a student of mine. He was a journalism major, minored in recreation, nice guy, really good, conscientious student. He's in this class with me the whole semester. At the end of the semester, there's something wrong. I can tell there's something wrong. And so everybody's cleared the room, and Eric comes up to me, and I said, Eric, what's going on here? My mother just died of cancer. I said, that's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that. And here's my life-changing advice. You know what I think you might enjoy? You should go hike the John Muir Trail. That was my contribution to his life. 20 years later, maybe, I get contacted by this fellow, Eric, when I'm in Florida. He said, first of all, my name's Eric Blem. Do you remember me? I said, Eric, there have been so many students. I'm sorry, I don't remember you. That's okay. I've written a book, and I acknowledge you in the book for the role you played in my life. And would you be interested in reading the book? And I remember my attitude. Again, I had just published a book, you know, right? Sure, young man, I'll read your book, right? So 2 months later, his book is nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It's the one in the upper left. It's called The Last Season. It's a wonderful book. It's nonfiction. It's about a backcountry wilderness ranger in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. Everybody wants to be like this guy. His name's Randy Morganson. In the middle of his 28th season, he disappears from the face of the earth. The book reads like a detective story. What happened to Randy Morganson, okay? How did Eric come on that theme? He followed my advice. He hiked the John Muir Trail, and in preparing for that trip, he met a retired National Park Service ranger named Alden Nash. They became buddies. They did 2 or 3 hikes together. They were going to go on a particular route this one summer, but Alden said, nope, we're changing our route because there's a ranger missing. And Eric Blem spent 8 years researching the book that culminated in The Last Season. He's since written 3 bestsellers. The 2 in the middle are about the war in Afghanistan. The Legend is about the Vietnam War. He's making a living, a very successful living as a commercial author. Every professor's dream, to actually make money writing, right? So that's a good story. Here's another good story. I'm new at San Diego State. This father and son come into my office. The father says, with the son right there, says, look, Scott's a nice kid, but his siblings are really intellectuals. They're going to be doctors and lawyers and such. Scott isn't interested really in book learning, but he seems to have good interpersonal skills. You know, do you think Parks and Rec might be a good career for him? And my big advice, incredible advice, was maybe. That was the last I saw of Scott Getterman until 4 years ago when he asked if I wanted to visit him in his office. And I said, sure. And I went and visited him, right? So for a quarter of a century, he's been the assistant superintendent of Yosemite National Park. That's not bad for a C student or whatever he was, and what a responsibility to be entrusted with that landscape and its protection, right, and its availability for us. All right. A lot of what I've been really lucky. There's a publisher in Sagamore Venture in Urbana, Illinois, that every 6 or 7 years, if I have more stories, will add to it. So I just gave Roger a copy of the 5th edition, which came out a year ago. It's now got maybe 61 stories in it, so it's kind of my life history. They charge way too much for it, which bothers me. I'm in constant hassles with them. But again, what's Thoreau talking about here? The first field of knowledge, right? And this is where I like to hang out. Sometimes people say, well, is there a overriding theme in all of your stories? And I said, well, the one that comes closest to it comes from a book called Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters. Do you know that book? Have any of you read that book? Late 19th century, maybe early 20th century. He creates this fictitious town in Illinois, Spoon River, Illinois, and he tells the story of the town through the epitaphs on all the gravestones, right? Well, there's one epitaph that has resonated with me my entire life, and I would say if there's a theme to my writing, it's similar to what is on Earl Greys' tombstone. And he says, I've studied many times the marble which was chiseled for me, a boat with a furled sail at rest in the harbor. In truth, it pictures not my destination, but my life. For love was offered me, and I shrank from its disillusionment. Sorrow knocked at my door, but I was afraid. Ambition called to me, yet I dreaded the chances. And all the while I hungered for meaning in my life. And now that I'm dead, I know that we must lift the sail and catch the winds of destiny wherever they drive the boat. To put meaning in one's life may end in madness, but a life without meaning is the torture of restlessness and vague desire. It's about longing for the sea, but afraid. I think life is nothing but risk. And the challenge for each of us is to decide which risks are worth taking and which aren't, right? But I think there's nothing but risk. And what this fellow found, Mr. Gray, was that he had risked the biggest thing of all. He hadn't really lived, because he was afraid of engaging in life and maybe failing, that sort of thing. All right, Canada. We start talking about Canada a little bit now. And again, for the younger people in the room, Roger and I were chatting about this earlier, the importance of getting involved very quickly, making a network of friends, getting to know people that might, there may be professional value to the association, but what happens if you get to be lucky enough to live to be my age is these professional relationships evolve into lifelong friendships. And the neatest thing about my life right now, you'll see it a little bit later, is the treasure trove of friends I have. And the fun we have, and the stories that we've accumulated over our lifetime. The fellow on the right is Jim Murphy. He was my idol. He was publishing books in his early 20s. I still remember the first time I saw him, he was walking into the MGM Grand Theater in 1977 in a green leisure suit, right? And he looked like he was a member of the Bee Gees. This was the same conference where your very own Roger Mannell wrote on the back of a keynote card an idea that he had about something called self as entertainment theory. And he's written that. I'm not just making that up. The man in the middle, any of you know that man? Some of you do. His name is Mark Searle. When I met him, he was at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. He was a therapeutic recreation specialist. Now he's the second person in charge of Arizona State University, a university that has well over 50,000 students. There's something in the water in Winnipeg, because another one of their faculty members, Mike Mahan, is now the president of the University of Lethbridge is that Alberta or Saskatchewan? Okay. And yet another person from that faculty, Ralph Nielsen, just retired as the president of Vancouver Island University. But they all got their start in Manitoba. Okay, these are backstories people don't know about. So, a quarter of a century ago, it's the same time Roger Ulrich told me about the Michigan connection. We went to a conference in Estes Park, Colorado. The man on the far left, Jeff Godbey, is a professor from Penn State, and Tom Goodale on the far end, who reminded me of George Kish. We played pool. And Jeff said, well, this is fun. We're all competitive about the same thing. And the next summer, we started this tradition of going to Jeff Godby's house in State College, Pennsylvania to shoot pool every June. It was a male support group. Tom had his life together. Jeff's never been together. Mine's never been together. And it was just neat. But we decided after a while that we needed to have a fourth. And the fourth one we added is this fellow who's second from the right that I'll talk a lot more about as we go forward. His name's Jack Harper. He's a former professor at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. We did this for a quarter of a century. 25 years, every June, we went to that house. And I would choose that conference over any other in the year if I had to make a choice. We became very good friends. We also found out the first year we each had dog-like personalities. Jeff, the big guy with the fluffy hair, was the big dog. If he thought you were afraid of him, he'd go after you. Tom was a terrier, ankle biter. While everybody else is goofing around, he's sinking balls in the corner pocket. I was the retriever because I was always trying to please everybody. And if we'd ever go anywhere in a car, I'd be in the back seat with my head out the window. We did add this fourth, and we chose Jack Harper from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg for very specific reasons. First of all, he's a gourmet cook, okay? And that was really important to us. Second of all, he was a best friend of Neil Young. Do you know that name, Neil Young, when I say Neil Young? Jack, who is in the lower right foreground, was the drummer for Neil Young's first band, the Squires. Neil Young is in that picture. Do you recognize him? He's right behind Jack, the man with the music t-shirt and the sunglasses. That's Neil Young, probably as 18, 17-year-old, before he goes on the road. Jack and I have become very good friends. I always felt sorry for him living in Winnipeg. There's nothing up there but wind. There's nothing to stop the wind from the Rocky Mountains. But he always told me he had this place in Desolation Sound in British Columbia. I should visit him sometime. And after several years of prodding me and sending me photos like this, I said, okay, Jack, I'll come. I'll go save Jack. So I went up to Desolation Sound, and you had to motor to his cottage. He went from a little town called Lund, where he moored a boat, north of Powell, which is north of Vancouver. And he had prawn traps set out in the bay, and we would harvest mussels and clams, and we would catch rock cod and throw them in the air, and bald eagles would take them out of the air. And periodically we'd see a whale. This is a guy who needs saving. He saved me, and of course he's a gourmet cook, right? Well, he moved that operation to Lake of the Woods a couple years ago, and he invites me, of course, and I get this stinking little fish, and a week later, Dan, look what you could have got if only you were a better angler or something, right? So Jack and I have had a great relationship, okay? All right, now I'm going to switch gears, and I think I can handle this okay. But it's like it's an important point. In 1993, on Super Bowl Sunday, I'm driving from Taos, New Mexico to Cimarron, New Mexico, to give a talk at the Philmont Scout Ranch. It's a beautiful day, everything's snowy, and I stumble on this chapel, and I'm curious, and I go into it. There's nobody else there. Remember, everybody's watching the Super Bowl. And I find out that the chapel was built by a man named Victor Westphal. He was a physician, and it commemorated the life of his son David, who was killed in Vietnam. And there's a view out to the left side overlooking a valley, and it's just very, very peaceful, and it lends itself to prayer and thanksgiving. And the chapel has been likened to the arms of the earth, welcoming home the men and women who served in Vietnam. Cradling those who didn't, and embracing the families who loved them all. So I take in the view, I turn around to leave, and along the back wall there are photographs. And there are a dozen of them, and this month they're commemorating men from Missouri. So I get up to the photographs, and it's like Robert Anspach missing in action, Henry Casebolt, Gary Grissom, Jeffrey Hicks, Carl Hauser, Robert Hubbard, Galen Humphrey, Randolph Spears, Henry Tejada, Rafael Tenorio, and Sam Tenorio. And my heart stops because one of the names belongs to someone I know. And what got me and still gets me, I had been living 25 years, a quarter of a century, oblivious to the fact that he lost his life 6 months after we left Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And what I realized, of course, in that instant was that we never accomplish anything in life by ourselves. We never do. We say it, but we don't. We're all standing on the shoulders of countless unnamed others who have given of themselves, who sacrificed themselves so the rest of us might remain free to build a more civilized and enduring society. So whether we live in Canada or the United States, Canada, the 11th province, or anywhere else in the free world, that brings with it not only an opportunity, right, to live our lives as we choose, but I think it brings an obligation to live our lives in a way that honors those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. So I see opportunity and obligation together constituting our freedom, and I think history will judge each of us by the use we make of that freedom. All right, so you got to fast forward with me now a few years. I go to the University of Utah. I have a chance to hire someone. And the person I'm going to hire, I've been stalking for a decade, not that kind of stalking. I've been following her career. And I want to hire her really, really badly. Her name's Kelly Bricker. And I realized to land her, I've got to create a job for her husband, Nate Bricker. And I realized I can't treat him as an appendage to her. I have to bring him over independent of Kelly and so on and so forth. And he comes over and visits, and he brings his boss, who's a man named George Wendt, who owns a river running company in the 11th province called Oars. And Oars is the premier river running company in the United States. And we end up hiring Kelly and Nate, and a year later, George, to show he's a good sport, offers to take me on a river trip down the Green River in northeastern Utah, just for a recreational outing and to chat. And so we do that, and it's wonderful, largely because of George's graciousness. And on the drive back from Vernal, Utah to Salt Lake, he says, let's do something. I'm at a point in my life where I'd like to give back. Maybe there's something we can partner on, and he mentions veterans. So a year later, we take 13 veterans down the same stretch of river, 10 men, all with post-traumatic stress, 3 women, post-traumatic stress. It's an amazing experience. It's a recreational outing. I'm just watching. And I come back so full of ideas and so enthused, and I go to our Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I say, Dean Rudd, I think there's something here that... And he's a clinical psychologist, and he specializes in marital counseling. He said, how long were you on the river? I said, 4 days. He said, that's 96 hours. He said, do you know how long it would take me to get 96 hours of clinical time? Maybe we can use river running as a context or a therapeutic venue for marital counseling. And he said, oh, I can get the money. That's not an issue. And I'm thinking, wow, this is it. You know, I've broken through. I'm into the grant world that you folks operate in. And 2 weeks later, the guy's hired as provost at the University of Memphis. There goes the balloon again, right? Well, a year later, I make another connection, a man named Stacy Bear, who's the military outdoor coordinator for the Sierra Club. And we decide that we got to have a conference to get people together who are working with veterans in the outdoors. And we have a conference. And we publish a book of proceedings out of the conference. And again, I don't want to make this long, but turns out, unbeknownst to me, in the audience at the conference were philanthropists and who never gave money to do research, only to support programs they thought were meaningful. But 18 months later, they gave me $750,000 with no strings attached, said, go study this stuff. So for the last 5 years, we've been doing this. I want to mention another fellow here, just because I think it's an interesting story. Mark Havitz will appreciate it if he's not aware of it. Any of you read Edward Abbey? You know Edward Abbey stuff? Any of you? You do? Okay. One of the great environmental writers and activists in the 11th province. He's no longer living. But he's most well known for a book he wrote called Desert Solitaire, which is nonfiction. But then he wrote another book that's probably more popular called The Monkey Wrench Gang. It's a work of fiction about these 4 characters that travel around the southwest of the United States throwing figuratively and literally monkey wrenches into developmental projects, sand into radiate, that sort of stuff. And their ultimate goal is to blow up Glen Canyon Dam. And one of the craziest characters in the monkey wrench gang is a man named Hayduke. Do you remember Hayduke? Or you didn't read that book? You maybe...
I didn't read that.
All right. Well, you got to read this book. Anyway, Hayduke's built upon this human being named Doug Peacock, right? And I only know this, I meet Doug Peacock when he's in his mid-70s and I'm in my early 70s. And turns out he's from Alma, Michigan. He went to the University of Michigan at the same time I went to the University of Michigan. He was in the School of Natural Resources at the same time I was in the School of Natural Resources. The only difference between us really is at the end of our education, I went to East-West German border to study Russian. He went to Vietnam to be a medic. And he got really messed up psychologically in Vietnam. He came home, he wanted nothing to do with the VA, he wanted nothing to do with clinical therapy, he didn't really want much to do with people. But in the process of all that working it out, he befriended Edward Abbey, and he also did something else. He spent 35 years in the backcountry of Yellowstone, Glacier, the larger states of Wyoming and Montana, studying grizzly bears. He's now one of our country's foremost experts on grizzly bears. So that was his therapy. And so that's why I wanted him at this symposium, that we are talking about nature's healing effects on veterans. And, he was a good one to have. And so we've just been involved in a 5-year program of research, and we're studying river running as a therapeutic recreation medium. We're studying nature walks, local things you can do inexpensively close to home for families of veterans, of armed forces personnel when one of the parents is deployed, to see if we can help improve family functioning in the absence of that parent. And at the first symposium, we had a clinical psychologist who was skeptical of all the research that has been done to support this. He's a traditional kind of scientist. His name is Bryan. And I think he used like equestrian therapy as something to slam, to say the research supporting that isn't as, And so rather than get defensive, I invited him into the work, right? And so he's been studying traditional cognitive processing therapy, behavioral therapy, with veterans with PTSD at the National Ability Center in Park City, Utah. What's different about what he's doing out there is bringing the family along with a veteran, and they're interspersing therapy with outdoor recreation, and he's found he can make strides that used to take 9 weeks in 2 weeks. So what's different about this experience, right? So that's kind of cool. I don't know, these are the contexts. These are the kinds of things we deal with. What kind of a therapeutic value can these places have? This is an interesting slide. I've done a lot of work with, they're called the 2nd 7th. They're Marines from one of the larger Marine battalions in the United States. They have the highest suicide rate of any military group in the US. And I've been on 3 or 4 river trips with them in southern Utah. And there's a book, any of you know Sebastian Junger? Do you know that name? You know the book A Perfect Storm? Do you know the movie A Perfect Storm? Okay. Well, Sebastian Junger wrote the book upon which the movie is based. He's also really interested in things military. And he wrote a book about 1.5 years ago called Tribe. And this book basically says that humankind has always been tribal in nature. Tribe is important to us, whether it's family, community, right? It's really... And I've come to believe that one of the most important functions these river trips play for the 2nd, 7th Marines is it gives them a chance to reconstitute the tribe. In a time when no one's clear about what you're fighting for, right? What you fight for is to keep yourself alive and the person next to you alive. And that bond is incredibly strong. When you get discharged from the military, that bond dissolves and you're on your own, and that's when people have problems. So we found, I think, and I feel really pretty good. I mean, I would even call it defensible science. What we found is that, but instead of a common enemy, it's now a class 5 river, or something like that. And so that's been neat to watch. They do everything together. They cook together, they sleep together, they talk together, they teach each other unmercifully. And I can't even get into the group because I'm not a Marine from there. All right. The other thing I feel pretty strongly about, these trips, I think, change perspective. So often folks feel like the entire world's on their shoulders. And even when I taught at San Diego State, I would take students to the bottom of the Grand Canyon so they could touch the Vishnu schist which is rock that is as old as the earth itself. And when you're in that situation, you realize that you're maybe not so significant, and maybe there is a larger world that precedes whether you want to be in it or not. And so I found that to be healthy. And then I've learned so much about Roger's wife being involved in training service dogs. And before I hang up my spurs, I'm going to do a big service dog research project because I want to understand that relationship. I've seen it operate, and it blows my mind. The empathy on the part of the dog just is something I want to get a better handle on. All right, okay. And then I gave Ron a copy of this book, and I guess Mark and Roger already have one. But part of what I promised the granting agency is I would create a photo essay that would express visually what all this work is about. And so this is a little book that just came out, and I asked a lot of people to help me do that book, and the only one that responded was President Carter. And so he wrote the foreword to the book. All right. I'm getting close to the end here, folks. I want to say something about my relationship to science, okay? One of my high school classmates is an artist, and I had her do like a wall, sort of a forest-themed wall mural for me, and she put this quote in it for me, and it kind of expresses beautifully where I'm at in my thinking, right? I hang out somewhere. If you can think of this as an intersection, there's natural science, there's social science, and there's a humanity, the humanities. Somewhere where they all maybe touch. I don't know if it's a Venn diagram. I doubt if they actually overlap. But the point is, it's in that peripheral area that I spend a lot of time thinking about things and trying to figure out if there's more than one way to know something, right? And that's why I said earlier that my leanings are probably more journalistic than they are social scientific, right? But also influencing my thinking. About 15 years ago, maybe it's 20, I've got to go back to when William Clinton was president, I had a conversation in Florida with a woman named Rosanna Beerbaum, who was a dean of the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources. And she was also President Clinton's chief science advisor. And I said, you know, Dr. Beerbaum, tell me, how much does science influence public policy formation? She said, Dan, I would say about 25%. That's not the number I wanted to hear, right? I wanted to hear her say, well, all public policy is a function of what we know with some certainty through science. No. And so I realized there's a lot more at work here, right? There's a lot, and you know this now with what we're struggling with in the 11th province in climate change, right? Scientists never agree on anything, and yet they agree on climate change, and our leaders won't respect that. It drives me crazy. All right. I'm also now dabbling in fiction. I was telling some other people about this earlier, and this book has just come out, and none of you, ask your grandparents or your great-grandparents if they ever knew about the Fuller Brush Man back in the 20th century in the 11th province. And a door-to-door salesman that would go around selling, typically the woman of the house, household cleaning products. They'd have a little conversation, make a sale, maybe not, tip their hat, and they'd be on their way. And we decided we wanted to write a story about the 21st century equivalent to the Fuller Brush Man. We'll call it the Fuller Life Man. He too is selling something, but it doesn't cost money. He's trying to sell you on a new way of life. And so we have 5 selling points in here. We have some other themes embedded. And then you get to the end of it, and then there's a link to an electronic workbook. And you go through all the selling points and decide whether you want to buy or not buy. You think about the other themes, and then you're charged at the very end with writing your own 21st century Canadian dream statement or American dream statement. And we don't know what it's going to amount to, but it interests us. And this is, I remember the guy I mentioned way up front, the guy that drove me crazy, Arthur Harkins, the futurist? He gave me a book to read called Anthropology Through Science Fiction. And there was a story in that book called Frog Pond about the downside of human adaptability. And I ended up writing an essay for environmental ethics about all of that in the context of outdoor recreation. Could we become satisfied with increasingly deteriorating quality environments, right? I may not do this, but I'm interested in doing it. I'm looking for people who might be interested. I would like to help edit a book called Leisure Studies Through Science Fiction, where you take something like self-determination theory, right? And someone has to figure out how to write a story that expresses the logic of the theory, but in an engaging story. Part of all this is rooted in my interest in trying to get students to read more, because that's a problem where I work. And this Fuller Life Man, it takes you as long to read it as it does for him to make the sales pitch, about 15 minutes, right? Anyway, all right, I was not lying about Jack Harper and Neil Young. That's Jack Harper now, and that's Neil Young now, okay? So I'm not making this stuff up. But I'm reaching an interesting point in my life. I'm a little longer in the tooth. Some of the people I knew earlier in life are at different stages of their lives. This was the guy from Michigan, Bev Driver, who did so much to work on the left side of my brain. He now has early dementia. And I'm interacting with him and trying to figure out how to... The sucker can still catch trout on a fly rod, but beyond that, it's an interesting experience for me. The other thing, I thought, I'm so smart. The way I'll keep myself young is by hanging around with younger people, right? All it's done is exacerbated the distance, especially since they live their lives with smartphones and so on and so forth. But these are three of my favorites. Jeff Rose, who Corey Johnson writes with. I don't know if others of you who write. He's on our faculty. He's wonderful. Carrie Schwab at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She co-authored that little Fuller Life Man book. And Chris Zahowski just took a position at Old Dominion. These are if you could steal any of them, you would be really lucky, right? But they're all wonderful scholars. And this is what it's like when we work together, especially since Jeff speaks a different language than I do. His language is full of, I don't know, help me here, post-structural, critical, this is and that's, and wow. So when he takes the lead on something, I've got to suspend my disbelief and say, okay, if it means something, I can't even get by his titles, right? Anyway, but we've written a lot. Look at these little, I'm really proud of this. I'll say this in front of the group, because I'm not a researcher, but I've been able to get 4 or 5 research reflections pieces in leisure sciences. And the one at the bottom is the most read thing I've ever written in my life, I think. And it comes from Daniel Kahneman, right? In Thinking Fast and Slow, right? This fellow I was telling you about. So we've had fun. And this is something else. I mean, these are secrets that people wouldn't want me to tell. About 10 years ago, I got some friends together, all former administrators, academic administrators. So Troy could be a candidate someday. Roger's already a candidate. We used to be somebody, but now we aren't. And we got together in San Diego, California over NCAA basketball weekend to have a good time, to drink, to reminisce. We had such a good time the first time when we moved to Las Vegas. And at the end of the Las Vegas meeting, I said, by the way, my wife calls these affectionately boondoggles. She's never really been an academic. Anyway, but I said, we're having fun, but we're having these neat conversations about administrative war stories. If we could write something out of each of these get-togethers that could be useful, it could be a contribution, and we could write the trips off as a business expense. I mean, I'm not as dumb as I look. So, Gene Lamke on the right, San Diego State, Professor Emeritus, Kerry McDonald, Illinois' former chair, my friend Jack Harper, who gets in on everything, and then me. So we go San Diego, we go Las Vegas, we go to New Orleans, we go to Key West, Florida. Do you see some themes here? We go back to Austin, Texas, we go to Tempe, Arizona, we go back to San Diego, we go to Lexington, Kentucky, we go to Savannah, Georgia. This year, for our 10th anniversary, I guess, we're going to Washington, D.C. And I've already figured out next year we're going to Palm Springs, California, for reasons I won't go into. But see, this is stuff we write. And I'm teased a lot about publishing in this journal, like no one reads it. But no one reads any of these journals, so except people who write for them, right? But it's working, right? And I threw this in just, I thought it'd be fun. Every one of these articles would not have been written if Donald Trump were not president of the United States. Usually I see professors being like manatees. We're relatively harmless. We're bottom feeders. We're vegetarians. We rise up once in a while to breathe, but then we don't bother anyone anymore. But his presidency is causing people like me to come out from under the cover of the ivory tower. And, and so the one we wrote about crossing the Rubicon is, what can you say, especially if you want to say something political, that your university doesn't feel like, and that sort of thing. So we've been doing a lot of that. That's been good. Any of you recognize this fellow? When I first met Roger, it was an early NRPA conference, and I saw him moderate a research panel, and we hadn't met, and I saw him take every one of the papers apart and have every one of the presenters feel good about themselves when it was done. And I thought, I got to meet this guy. And so I went up right afterwards. We'd never met. I introduced myself and immediately invited him to visit San Diego. And he was really skeptical. He said, I don't like to leave my family. I mean, he was making that part up. But I think he did a background check. He found that I wasn't that bad a human being. We had a retreat in Cardiff, California, all about what does it mean to be a professor. And the dignitary we invited was a man named Howard Williams from the University of Minnesota. I took one course from him at Minnesota called Effective College Teaching. I ended up dedicating that book to him. That's not common for one professor, but he was such a neat guy. When you'd go to his office, he'd always have coffee there and cookies, and when you were in his company, the rest of the world didn't exist. He would shut everything out and focus just on you, and I grew really fond of him, and Roger still remembers, I think, him. All right. There again, this is the last time Roger's path and mine crossed. Antelope Island outside of Salt Lake City, Utah in 2012. I think we'd all agree that neither of us have aged, or we're looking pretty good for our, right? The other thing I wanted to just mention briefly in winding down, there's a fellow at SUNY Cortland who was at Cortland named Harlan Gold Metcalf, and his mantra was, stay in the presence of the best people in the sphere in which you seek attainment and make an honest response. And I feel like that's what I've tried to do. Goodale, you gave Goodale, who was at Ottawa for 16 years before he went back to the 11th province, you gave him an honorary PhD. Carla Henderson is one of your award winners, but also, I believe, received an honorary doctorate. Didn't you? Mark Havitz, I think I gave you your career when I think about it. When Mark was just starting out, I wrote an article in Parks and Recreation dissing marketing. So this is like the lowest thing you could do, and he struck back, and
with great trepidation.
With great success, and has had a wonderful career. Godby came to University of Waterloo for a couple of years when he was a pup, as an administrator, and of course your own Dr. Shaw in the middle. So, lots of writing's what I love to do, and I continue to do it. Goodale said if you write in our field and you're good at it, you might get enough money every year to buy an operable used car. And that's pretty much the story, I think. So you don't write for the money. The other thing I wanted to, this friendship thing means a lot to me. And on your left is Carla Henderson, a few years ago. This is really ironic. Carla Henderson was a student of mine at the University of Minnesota. I don't remember her being a student. She had hair down to her waist, and she was very shy and didn't say a thing. And Leo, of course, everybody loves Leo McAvoy. And so, where does the time go? Like, that seems like yesterday afternoon to me, but this was yesterday afternoon. And so I'll leave you with this. When I turned 70, I decided that I wanted to hike the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. I thought that'd be a good thing to do, right? And so I did that. But I got about 750 miles into the walk, and I had what I now call a Forrest Gump moment, where I realized that I was being really selfish, that there were people on the outside of my experience who could benefit from me being with them. And so I just kind of stopped and turned around and left the trail. And I remember as I was walking out to the trailhead to leave the Sierra Nevada, this group of day hikers were coming in, and they were in their 40s and 50s, and the guy in front must have been the leader, and he sized me up, he looked me over, he saw my hollow eyes, the scruffy beard, he saw the sort of emaciated figure, and he said, "Good morning, old timer." And I thought, Jesus, And then I said, okay, I'll give him that. I guess I am an old timer, but I know I'm not dead yet, right? And I had just walked the hardest section of the Pacific Crest Trail, 750 miles through the Southern California desert, and I was still open to life and what it had to teach me, and I wasn't dead yet. And so, the challenge for me, as I suspect should be the challenge for each of you, is that you don't ever let anybody tell you can't do something because of your age, because of your height, because of your weight, because of your gender, because of your ethnicity, your race, right? Your disability, right? I think the challenge for all of us is to recognize, how would I say this? To recognize the uniqueness of the gift that is our life, and then to make the most of it. It's okay to disagree with me. It's okay to say your life experience has been different. Life isn't about risk, it's about safety and protection and never going to sea. Right? Or do you see examples in those stories of chaos theory? Little bitty things that didn't seem like much at the time but ended up being really consequential, right? It's important to keep chaos theory in mind because you're going to have conversations with people, especially young people. I think about camping, organized camping, and what a counselor might say to a child, positive or negative, without giving much thought to it and not realizing that down the road, could have been something significant.
I do have a question.
Sure.
So you wrote that article about marketing is,
Right.
will protect the little person. And Hobbit said something else. Did Hobbit convince you of anything? He says marketing is not synonymous with commercialism. I remember that.
Yeah.
Did he convince you of anything? Anything at all? It's okay to say no.
No, it's not that, no. Because I remember there was an issue with Crompton later on, too, where he had a doctoral student from Russia or something who convinced him that there was a little bit more. Like most things, we polarize the two, right? And it's probably something else in them. Help me here. This is your chance to get square with me and make it all.
I'm just wondering when colleagues talk,
right.
alternative views, do they either want to convince the other of anything?
Okay, I know where this is coming from. This is coming from lunch. We talked about this.
No, just my general bitterness in life.
Are we? Yeah. So are any of us actually open to receiving a different point of view than the one we find so much comfort currently in? Well, I like to think I am,
But did you find his argument compelling? Because I remember reading both your...
Yeah, I mean...
I think one of the things that I value most about our field, and especially my experiences at the University of Waterloo, is that we've generally been pretty darn good at setting up situations where people can put themselves out there and disagree and not get their head chewed off. And so when I taught marketing for a number of years, and I haven't done it for about a dozen years, I would say I spent a good 20% of the class critiquing it. Interspersed through every aspect of whatever we called the marketing mix and the this, that, and the other thing. And the class always started with your paper. And we would come back and we would talk about those type things. And I see that in, if I think about my colleagues and the way we handle anything.
Yeah. Yeah, let me add to that because I think it's really interesting. One of the things we don't do in our literature that I would kill for is have point-counterpoint kinds of conversations. And the journals seem to shy away from controversy. And I was telling folks earlier today, I'm now involved in two things that I think I'm going to turn into special issues. One is the whole issue of, if you're interested in language as much as I am, you can imagine how painful it is to live in the 11th province now where language seems to have lost its meaning. You can say one thing on Monday and turn around and say nobody seems to care, and so that bothers me a lot. And I got involved in the last year, without going into detail, into questions surrounding the use of gendered personal pronouns. And I ended up writing something for a journal, and they've had it for a long, for all I know, some of you may have reviewed it, but it still isn't out there. And so I wrote the editor and said, look, how about if we use this as like an opening article, and then we get all kinds of reactions to it. You know, is language really a weapon, or is it just correct or incorrect, right? You know, and how important is emotional safety and physical safety and all these issues, and what's the relationship with freedom of speech and all that stuff. And so I'm hoping they give me the go-ahead, and I know this is a nice compliment for this department. I know that if they give me the go-ahead, I'll be coming to this group of faculty members and maybe graduate students for those kinds of contributions to get people thinking. I also, about 2 weeks ago, I went to a workshop at the University of Utah on authorship. And everybody else at the workshop was in the medical school, and then there's Dan. And they used as the framework for the conversation, there's an international committee of medical journal editors, and they've come out with criteria. And they're very strict about these 4 criteria. And if you haven't met all 4 criteria, you have no business having your name on a manuscript. And I sat through the workshop, and it's the balloon feeling again. And I said, my God, I've been unethical my entire career in how I've treated this matter of authorship according to their criteria. So I've written about this, and it's under review. But I think that would be a neat special issue for like Scully or something. Like, how do you deal with authorship? And does it matter if you're a junior professor, a senior professor? Because we're moving in the direction of parsing it down, where people want to know. You know, I think I could be wrong about the number, but I'm not far off. I think when they figured out the human genome, I think when they authored that article, it had like 900 authors on it. You know, well, how do you factor in the significance of contributor 832? I mean, you know, does she or he get promoted, right, or tenured? So I think authorship is, you know, authorship, language, those would be great issues that we could have probably highly controversial opinions about. And I'd like to see that more in our literature. So, and it's kind of what we had was a microcosm of what could be a much larger conversation. So that would be neat, yeah. Anything else? You've been kind to me. I want to see the posters. Is that what's next?
That's what's next.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'd really like to thank Dan Dustin
Well, it's my pleasure.
very much for being here today.
It's an honor.
I'd like to think that if I encountered Dan along a path, I wouldn't call him an old-timer, but I can certainly he certainly proved today that he's not dead.
I'm not dead.
And that he's got some exceptional intellectual thinking that I hope people found profound and will think on themselves. So thank you very much.
I couldn't ask for
today.
more, so thank you.
But I want to formally congratulate you as our 2019 recipient of the Shaw-Mannell Leisure Research Award.
Well, thank you.
For your contributions to leisure research. So thank you on the behalf of our department.
Again, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Wow. That's very nice. Thank you.